Joined now by Zach Osterman from the Indy Star. Make sure you're giving him a follow. Be a subscriber to keep up on all things, all sports for the entire state. Thanks a lot for joining us as always, Zach. Appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me as always.
A busy week, man. We started off with when was John? When was the football coach? When did that happen? Was that last Friday?
That was a week ago. That was Friday. Yeah.
See, it's just been all that stuff piling into one games, and now the Pacers winning last night, which was huge. A gigantic weekend this weekend coming up, but it gets even bigger next weekend, Zach, with this weekend, of course, Indiana takes on Auburn, and then Purdue has Alabama. Next weekend, Indiana and Kansas, Purdue, Arizona. So the college basketball world is focused firmly on with the Hoosier teams over the next 2 weekends. But Indiana is playing pretty well right now. Their game has definitely improved. And we've seen that even though they've lost Xavier Johnson for a period. Gabe Cupps has stepped up and done a solid job filling in at point guard. But more importantly, it's the improvement of Kel'el Ware, of Malik Renew playing within all of this, and Mackenzie Mbako really starting to, I always say this, I got to stop using this term, but starting to find his sea legs.
Yeah, I think. Listen, I don't begrudge anybody who still has some doubts over this team, or at very least over the potential for there being a ceiling on the way Indiana's playing. Because I wouldn't just sort of expect Indiana to suddenly hit a bunch of threes and just turn into a completely different team. But what they do, it's fair to say they do well. They need to limit turnovers a little bit more, but the flip side is they've gotten better rebounding the ball. They are, I think, as reliable as any Indiana team has been in a while in terms of free throw rate. I mean, right now, their free throw rate, which is for people who doesn't know, that's how many free throws they attempt as a percentage of how many field goals they attempt. So basically, how many free throws are you attempting per shot, if you sort of understand what I'm saying. Their free throw rate right now is not just the highest it's ever been under Mike Woodson. It's the highest it's been, if you look back through the KenPom database, it's the highest it's been going as far back as KenPom does to 1997. Bob Knight's 97 team had a free throw rate of 49.9%. Right now, Indiana's at 47.5%. That number will probably go down a little bit. Those numbers are always goosed up in the non-conference by the teams that are just sort of physically or athletically overmatched that you play. But the point is, Indiana's doing that really well. Again, I think Indiana has gotten a little bit better rebounding the ball, and they just shoot twos so well. And it's not, I don't think either of these guys is necessarily better at the college level than Trace Jackson Davis was. But when you have Kel'el Ware and Malik Renew, and increasingly, to your point, Mackenzie Mbako, you just have more depth of options and guys that could lead you in scoring on any given night, rebounding on any given night, guys that can trade sort of the position of focal point within the offense back and forth really comfortably. And Indiana is just kind of building a floor under itself where you can count on the fact that because they're so good at getting really good high percentage shots, this team is going to be really hard to kind of keep out of the scoring column, and you're going to get, I think, some games like Michigan the other night.
Yeah, I think that and with the improvement of it's more about confidence with Kel'el Ware, it seems. I'm not sure that he's gotten better. He's just more he's much more confident and he's challenging teams to play his game. And then you've got Malik Renew backing him up. They're both passing the ball really, really well. Mackenzie Mbako is not forcing things. He is taking what he gets and just riding it as it comes along. Todd Leary raves about his shooting. He says he's one of the best shooters that Indiana's brought in since Jay Edwards. And Todd doesn't say that kind of stuff. And that I was looking up. This is a guy who was on a team that still has 5 of the top 11 all-time 3 shooters in Indiana history. So that says a lot about him. His 17 straight free throws to start the year says a lot about his ability to stay focused and a shooting stroke. The guard position is where Indiana has not gotten a ton of scoring, definitely not getting 3-point shooting, which it's not that you have to have a ton of it, but and until, even if Gabe Cupps is not really comfortable there yet from that aspect, if he could just get to the free throw line a little bit more often, because he's shooting his free throws very well. Trey Galloway is still trying to find, I don't know if without Xavier he's a little more lost. He's not putting up 3-point shots, and his free throw shooting is just barely over 50%.
Yeah, I think on Mbako in particular, it feels like he's got a better sense for where to get his offense. You know, there's this, at least I think it's a fair debate over whether he's a 3 or a 4. He's clearly going to be the 3 for Indiana this year. And, you know, I won't profess to have seen a ton of him in high school or AAU. I saw little bits and pieces, and then obviously, you know, I looked at highlights. But it did feel like he was playing as much 4 as he was 3 at times. And so, you know, you can kind of wind up in a place where he's still figuring out, this is where I go get my offense when I'm playing on the floor with 2 bigs, you know, and 2 players that I think, to their credit, Malik Renew and Kalel Ware work really well together in the post. You know, in many ways, the same way Trace Jackson Davis and Race Thompson did. Sometimes you play two big men together, and it's almost like they kind of get in each other's way. They both want to occupy the same spots on the floor. They both sort of want to do the same things, particularly offensively. I think Ware and Renew complement each other really well, and Indiana's able, in part because Renew is such a good passer and Ware can be a threat faced up to the basket with long 2s or 3s, and so you can move him away from the rim and still get offense out of him. But I think those 2 complement each other very well, and I think Mbako just kind of, you know, on the floor has been trying to figure out where his points are when he's playing with both of those guys, or obviously, you know, maybe it's Peyton Sparks and Malik Renew, you know, just whatever the mix is of those players, if you understand what I'm saying. But I do think it's interesting, these last 3 games, what is this, 42 points, 18 rebounds, 4 assists. He's made all of his free throws. His 3-point shooting isn't amazing. He's 3 of 9, but that's, you know, better than where he was at the beginning of the season, which was, I think, one of 13 or something like that. I'm sure Mike Woodson would probably point to the rebound numbers too, you know, because that's, coaches always love to say that's a measure of hustle and work rate and whatever else. And Mbako has been a real force. He had 4 against Michigan, but he had 7 against Maryland and 8 against Harvard. It just feels like he is more comfortable in a lot of different ways. I don't think your line about sea legs was very far off. And, you know, you mentioned some other guys. I think Trey Galloway is one that Mike Woodson will want to get in a more sort of comfortable place offensively. And I think, you know, sometimes maybe part of the difficulty for Galloway is we saw him hit some 3s last season, but never really at volume. He's always been a player who wants to go downhill for his offense, not necessarily always, but very often. And if you're playing with essentially 3 bigs, 3 different kinds of bigs, but 3 bigs on the floor at any given time, there's not going to be as much room for a guard to get downhill and get at the rim. So, you know, it's probably going to be a work in progress, sort of getting Galloway to a place where he's comfortably kind of, you know, in rhythm offensively. But right now, for the moment anyway, and this will get us, you know, stress tested this weekend, you have a team that is really sort of built a solid foundation for itself offensively inside.
Yeah, and then defensively against Auburn, they have some guards that are shooting the ball really well. One of those is a freshman, and Aiden Holloway. His opening game against Baylor, he had 19 points and 6 assists. He is currently shooting over 40% from behind the arc, and Denver Jones alongside him. So Indiana is going to have to stay out and on these guys, and they've done a better job here of late with the 3-pointer. Obviously, the last 2 games we've looked at earlier this week when Dylan Sin was on, he pointed out that in the last 5 halves I believe it was, yeah, Indiana's opponents are 6 of 41 behind the arc for 14%. And while that's probably not a number that can continue at that astounding rate, they've got to keep up that kind of pressure.
No, I mean, just in general, when you're going to play a brand of offense that's, let's be honest, just has to work harder to score big numbers because you're shooting fewer threes, you're making fewer threes, and you're sort of relying on bigs and therefore twos. Your defense has to be there for you, and it doesn't always necessarily have to be like, oh, you held him to 0.7 points per possession. Look at how good you played. But it can be like Michigan the other night, where that game's back and forth. I think Indiana might have had a 7-point lead at one point. I think Michigan's largest lead was 5 or 6. It just kind of, tennis ball back and forth. But then if you look at those last kind of 2 minutes, Indiana made all the plays, and obviously had some good moments offensively. But you think about the Khalil Ware block. You think about some late CJ Gunn steals. Obviously, Khalil Ware's deflection to the inbound pass at the end of the game. Indiana's defense stepped up when basically the team that was going to find a higher level defensively was going to win the game. And, I'm sure Mike Woodson would sit here and say, we've still got a lot to get better at. We're probably never going to be where I want us to be. But, if nothing else, I do think it's fair to say Indiana's defense kind of is recognizing a little bit more often when and where and how to crank up, the pressure and create opportunities for itself.
This weekend, Indiana taking on this Auburn team, the first of back-to-back games, high marquee games, with Kansas coming in next weekend. And actually, I've been talking about it, just a huge next 2 weekends for the state of Indiana. You've got Indiana taking on Auburn this weekend, and Purdue taking on Alabama in a Big Ten SEC tussle of sorts. So the Big Ten looking to show out a little bit, and a lot of eyes on the Hoosier State.
I think these next 2 games are going to be fascinating for Indiana. We kind of looked at Maryland and Michigan, and I think broadly speaking, we all felt those were real stress tests, that Indiana seemed to kind of get a little bit better from getting roughed around against UConn, but you didn't know how much better because it was Louisville, it was Harvard. Here came 2 Big Ten teams. You're probably playing them in a good moment. Maryland's a mess right now. Like, I don't know what's going on there. Excuse me. But even Michigan, that was their 4th loss in a row. Juwan Howard's still not back to sort of full head coaching, at least not. I don't know exactly what that sort of setup is and how it works. But you probably played these 2 teams at a good time in the calendar. But it's still, teams that are going to finish probably somewhere between 8 and 12 in the Big Ten. Maybe 7 and 12 if we're being, kind of generous. How could you handle that? How would the improvement we feel like we've seen from Indiana over the last, let's say 4 halves of basketball before the Big Ten opener, how would that carry over? Well, that test was passed, pretty resoundingly. Indiana wiped the floor with Maryland and then went on the road and picked up a tricky road win at Michigan. Now you get a different kind of stress test, which is okay. You've gotten better. But now you need to prove that you can beat the kinds of teams, particularly away from home, that you're going to need to beat to go to the NCAA tournament. Because right now, and I don't, people shouldn't freak out about bracketology on December 8th. Like, that's just not a thing that anyone should worry about. But I don't think it's unfair to point out that, Indiana really hasn't added anything of quality to its resume through November and December. Win either one of these games. Auburn on a neutral floor would be really good. That'd be a quad 1 win. It'd probably hold up all year as a quad 1 win. Kansas at home, we all know what Kansas is, how good they can be, but that would probably hold up as a quad 1 win all year, and would just kind of get you to a place where in the micro, as long as you take care of business in those last 3 games around the winter break, you come out at worst 11-2, 2-0 in the Big Ten. You've done everything you needed to do at the baseline to feel good about where you are going into January and the resumption of Big Ten play. But in the macro, if this makes any sense, it's also kind of a stress test to say, can you, as currently constituted, playing basketball the way you're playing, relying on the lineups you're relying on, scoring the ball in the ways you are, and perhaps pointedly not scoring the ball in the ways you aren't. Does this system, is this team as currently constructed capable of competing with and beating the kinds of teams it's going to need to build an NCAA tournament resume? So I think I'm just kind of interested basically in the stress test of, okay, can this work against the teams you're going to have to beat to get where you want to go? And I think that's what I find so fascinating about these next 2 Saturdays.